A virgin giant cowboy paid $50 for a remote farm. Then 3 giant women inside said, "Breed us all." The church bell tolls. Dust swirls down the main street. And a lone cowboy, mocked as a fool, thinks he's finally bought himself freedom. But when he opens the cabin door, 3 towering women block his path and with trembling voices demand the unthinkable. Just as hope sparks, a deputy rides in with papers from the railroad papers that could take everything away. And when an orphan boy appears at the gate, followed by a desperate widow with land of her own, the story twists into a fight for honor, faith, and survival. Now the virgin giant must choose. Protect the women who mistrust him, honor the widow who needs him, and defend the boy who calls him father. Will he rise from shame to become the protector of a family or lose everything to greed and gossip? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button. For more, the spring morning air held a lingering chill as Chris Boone guided his horse down the rutted main street of Bent Creek. His worn boots settled deep in the stirrups, each step of his mount raising small clouds of dust. The courthouse loomed ahead, its weathered wooden facade a testament to frontier justice and opportunity. Chris's heart thumped harder as he drew closer. After 6 long years of cattle drives, sleeping under stars and saving every penny, he finally had enough to bid on land of his own. $50 burned a hole in his pocket, wadded bills earned through honest sweat and careful living. The street wasn't empty. A cluster of ranch hands lounged outside the general store, their laughter carrying on the morning breeze. Chris kept his eyes forward, but their words reached him anyway. "Well, if it ain't the virgin giant come to town." One called out, triggering. Snickers from his companions. Chris's neck burned red, but he didn't turn. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, he'd learned young that reaction only fed their sport. Instead, he focused on the courthouse steps ahead, each one bringing him closer to his dream. The building's interior smelled of dust and old paper. Wooden floorboards creaked under Chris's careful steps as he made his way to the clerk's desk. Behind it sat a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, his fingers ink-stained from handling documents. "Help you?" The clerk asked, barely glancing up from his ledger. Chris cleared his throat. "Yes, sir. Here for the land auction. The Peterson place out west." Now the clerk did look up, studying Chris with newfound interest. "That old farm's been sitting on our books for 3 years. Tax arrears mounting. You're the first to show any interest." "Reckon that's why I'm here," Chris said quietly. He pulled out his carefully counted money. "I've got $50. The clerk's eyebrows rose. A few other men in the courthouse turned to watch, their expressions ranging from amusement to disbelief. Chris heard their whispers. Giants fixing to play farmer and won't last a season. But kept his eyes on the clerk. $50, you say? The clerk thumbed through some papers. "Well, given nobody else has bid, property's been nothing but a burden on the county." He straightened, decision made. "I can accept that bid, mister. Boone. Chris Boone." The clerk nodded and began preparing the deed, his pen scratching across official paper. Chris stood straight and still, trying not to fidget as the document took shape. Each stroke of the pen brought him closer to having something that was truly his. "Sign." "Here," the clerk said finally, turning the paper around. Chris took the pen carefully in his large hand, conscious of every eye in the room on him. His signature was crude but legible. He'd practiced writing his name enough times to manage that much. The deed was his. Chris carefully folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. A flutter of triumph rose in his chest, despite the continued murmurs and chuckles from the courthouse crowd. "Good luck, Mr. Boone," the clerk said, already turning back to his ledger. "You'll need it out there." Chris touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement and made his way back outside. The morning had warmed some, but the spring wind still carried. Winter's bite. He mounted his horse with practiced ease, despite his size, and pointed the animal's head west. The day passed slowly as he rode, the sun tracking across the sky as fields gave way to rougher country. His new property lay at the end of an old wagon track, far enough from town to ensure privacy, but close enough to make supply runs possible. Chris had studied the location carefully before making his bid as dusk painted the sky in deep purples and oranges. He finally spotted the farmhouse. It was a sorry sight: weathered gray boards, sagging porch, weeds growing thick around the foundation. But it was his. Every broken window and loose shingle belonged to Chris Boone. Something caught his eye as he drew closer. A faint glow flickered behind one of the intact windows. Squatters, most likely. It wasn't uncommon in abandoned properties this far out. Chris reined his horse to a stop. Considering his options in the growing darkness, the lean-to beside the house still had most of its roof. Chris decided to make camp there for the night rather than force a confrontation in the dark. He unsaddled his horse, spread his bedroll, and settled in to watch the lamplight through the window. Tomorrow would be soon enough to sort things out. As he lay there, Chris pulled out the deed and traced his fingers over his name in the dim light. The paper made it real. This was his land, his chance to build something. The mockery of the townsfolk couldn't touch that truth. His large frame didn't quite fit under the lean-to's shelter. But Chris didn't mind. He'd slept in worse places during his years on cattle drives. The spring night grew colder, and he pulled his blanket tighter, watching his breath mist in the air. The lamplight inside the house flickered steadily, a warm glow against the darkness. Chris wondered about its source, who had taken shelter in his new home. He'd have to handle it carefully. Violence wasn't his way, but a man had to stand up for what was his. Sleep came slowly as Chris planned his approach for morning. He'd knock first, be polite, but firm. Surely reasonable people would understand once he showed them the deed. His last thoughts before drifting off were of the future. Crops growing in restored fields, cattle grazing on the back 40. Maybe even a family someday. The lamp burned low in the window, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Chris Boone, no longer just a hired hand but a landowner, slept under the stars one last time. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring, but tonight he had achieved something no one could take away. He had a place to call his own. The first rays of sunrise painted the eastern sky in soft pinks and golds as Chris stirred from his makeshift bed under the lean-to. His muscles ached from the hard ground, but hope warmed his chest as he looked at his new property in the morning light. The farmhouse stood silent now. No lamp visible through its windows. The old pump in the yard creaked as Chris worked the handle, rusty water spurting at first before running clear and cold. He splashed his face and neck, smoothed back his dark hair, and straightened his shirt as best he could. The mirror-bright surface of the water showed his reflection, a giant of a man trying his best to look presentable. Name's Chris Boone. He practiced quietly, rehearsing the words he'd say. Got the deed right here, but I aim to be neighborly about this. His voice sounded rough from disuse. He cleared his throat and tried again, softer this time. Just want to work the land, make something good here. The wooden steps of the porch groaned under his weight as he approached the door. Chris took a deep breath, settled his shoulders, and knocked firmly 3 times. The sound echoed in the morning quiet. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then footsteps approached from inside, several sets of them. The door swung open, and Chris found himself staring not up, but straight ahead into the faces of 3 women. His jaw dropped. They were giants like him. Each one stood well over 6 feet tall, with strong frames built for farm work. Their dresses were plain but clean, their faces weathered by sun and wind. The eldest stood slightly forward, her gray-streaked hair pulled back severely, while the youngest gripped a rifle with familiar ease. Between them stood a woman with gentle eyes that somehow made Chris even more nervous. All his practiced words scattered like startled birds. State your business, the eldest said sharply. Her voice carried authority earned through hard years. Chris fumbled in his shirt pocket and pulled out the deed. Name's Chris Boone. I bought this place yesterday at auction. Got the paper right here, ma'am. Hester, the eldest corrected firmly. And these are my sisters, Miriam and Ruthie. She pointed to the middle and youngest in turn. This land belonged to our kin before they vanished. We've worked it since. The county clerk didn't mention. Chris started. Course he didn't, Ruthie cut in, adjusting her grip on the rifle. Men in town pretend we don't exist out here. Easier that way. Miriam stepped forward slightly, her movement graceful despite her height. We've kept to ourselves, paid what we could. But times are hard and the railroad's been sniffing around. Chris's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. 3 women, tall as him, working this remote farm alone. The town's silence about them suddenly made more sense. People shunned what they didn't understand. He knew that well enough. Hester's next words hit him like a physical blow. If you mean to keep this farm, you'll need to marry one of us. Her tone was blunt, practical. Breed heirs or the railroad will take it. They're looking for any excuse to claim abandoned properties. Chris stumbled backward, nearly missing the porch step. Marriage? His face flushed hot enough to feel it in his ears. Ma'am, Hester, I won't force or shame anyone. That ain't right. Then what do you propose? Hester demanded. You've got the law's paper, we've got the work already invested. Railroad vultures circling, watching for weakness. Chris straightened his spine, finding steady ground in his convictions. Let me prove myself through honest work. Share the labor, treat you with respect. Give me that chance at least. The 3 sisters exchanged looks, having one of those silent conversations that close-knit families master. Ruthie's finger stayed near rifle's trigger, but Miriam's expression had softened slightly. The barn, Miriam said, finally, turning to Hester. We could let him stay there, just for tonight. Judge his character by his actions, like Papa always said. Hester's face remained stern, but something flickered in her eyes. Respect for her sister's wisdom, perhaps. One night, she agreed. But step wrong, and Ruthie's bullet won't care about your deed. Chris nodded solemnly. Yes, ma'am. Much? Obliged. The sisters withdrew inside, the door closing firmly. Chris stood for a moment, still processing everything that had happened. Then he walked to his horse, gathered his sparse belongings, and headed for the barn. The building was sturdy despite its age. The main beams still true. Chris spent the day making himself useful, mucking stalls, patching holes in the roof, fixing a broken hinge on the door. He worked steadily, aware of being watched from the house, but never looking directly at the window's dot as evening approached. Voices drifted through the barn's weathered boards. The sisters were on the back porch, close enough for their words, too. Carrie, he works hard, Miriam's voice said. And he didn't run when he saw us. Most men would have shot first, asked questions later, Ruthie admitted. Finding 3 giant women alone on their property. One day of work doesn't prove character. Hester countered. We've been fooled before. Not asking you to trust him yet, Miriam replied. Just to give him a chance to earn it. Chris settled into the hayloft as their voices faded, their debate unresolved. The sweet smell of dried grass surrounded him. As he knelt in the darkness, Lord, he whispered, I don't rightly know what you've led me into here, but please help me do what's right by these women. Help me be worthy of their trust, whatever comes. He paused, adding softly, and maybe help them see I'm more than just another man with a piece of paper. The night breeze whispered through. The barn's gaps, carrying the familiar sounds of crickets and distant coyotes. Chris lay back in the hay, his mind full of tall women with proud faces and the strange turns life could take. Sleep came slowly, but it came with hope that tomorrow might bring understanding, if not yet trust. Through the barn's high window, the stars wheeled overhead, watching over giant women and a gentle man, all of them trying to find their way forward on this small piece of frontier land. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as Chris stirred from his makeshift bed in the hayloft. His back was stiff from the night spent on hard planks, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in years. He had a purpose now, even if it came wrapped in complications he'd never imagined. From his saddlebags, he pulled out the last of his traveling, Supplies, coffee beans, dried beef, and 3 precious eggs he'd carefully wrapped in cloth. The farm's outdoor kitchen area had a stone hearth, and Chris set about building a small fire, careful not to make too much smoke. He ground the coffee beans between 2 flat stones, a trick he'd learned on cattle drives. "Ain't much," he muttered to himself, "but it's offered honest." The coffee pot bubbled promisingly as he arranged the dried beef on a clean bandana and gently fried the eggs in his trail skillet. The farmhouse door creaked open as he finished cooking. Ruthie emerged first, rifle still in hand, followed by Miriam and Hester. Their faces showed a mix of wariness and curiosity. "Made breakfast," Chris said, gesturing to his humble offering. "Not trying to buy favor, just seems right to share what I have," Ruthie snorted. 3 eggs for 4 people? That's barely a mouthful each." "Ruthie," Miriam chided softly. She stepped forward, her height graceful in the morning light. "It's a kind gesture, Mr. Boone, thank you." "Just Chris, ma'am," he replied, feeling his ears warm at her gentle tone. The moment of peace shattered at the sound of hoofbeats approaching. A horse and rider appeared around the bend in the road, kicking up dust. The sisters tensed visibly, and Chris noticed how they shifted to block the farmhouse door. The rider wore a deputy's badge that caught the morning sun. He dismounted with the ease of someone used to delivering unwelcome news, a leather document case tucked under his arm. "Deputy Carl Jennings," he announced, tipping his hat with false courtesy. "That some papers need reading." His eyes flickered. Between Chris and the sisters, a slight smirk playing at his lips. "We're having breakfast," Hester said firmly. "Whatever it is can wait." "Afraid it can't, ma'am." The deputy pulled out an official-looking document. By order of the Territorial Court, acting on behalf of the Western Pacific Railroad Company. He cleared his throat and began reading in a loud, formal voice. Chris felt his stomach sink as the legal language washed over them. The railroad was contesting his deed, claiming prior right to the farm through some earlier survey stake. Unless the Boone family could prove permanent residence and produce heirs within 1 year, the land would revert to railroad control. "Surveyors will be out next week," Deputy Jennings finished, rolling up the paper with obvious satisfaction. "Just doing my duty, letting you know." He mounted up, adding over his shoulder, "Might want to start packing. Save yourselves the trouble." They watched him ride away, the untouched breakfast growing cold on the hearth. Hester's face had turned to stone, while Ruthie gripped her rifle so tight her knuckles showed white. "This is what we feared," Miriam said softly. "They won't rest until they have every piece of land along their planned route." Chris stood straight, his voice steady despite the tremor in his heart. "I won't abandon you. The deed's legal, and we'll fight this together." "We?" Hester's voice cut sharp as a blade. "There is no we here, Mr. Boone. You're still a stranger with a piece of paper." "A piece of paper that might save this farm," he countered. "Let me prove myself. Put me to work. Test my word." The sisters huddled together, speaking in low voices. Chris waited, watching the sun climb higher, feeling the weight of futures balancing on this moment. Finally, Hester turned back to him. "The north fence needs mending. Ruthie will show you where." One wrong move. She left the threat unspoken. "Yes, ma'am," Chris nodded. "Thank you." The day passed in honest labor. Ruthie led him to a stretch of fence where posts had rotted and wire sagged. They worked mostly in silence, though Chris caught her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. By midday, Miriam brought them water and cornbread. Her quiet presence easing the tension. Chris worked steadily, letting his actions speak. He'd learned young that trust had to be earned through deeds, not words. When he found a nest of rattlers under a fallen post, he killed them quickly and buried them deep. Earning a grudging nod from Ruthie, the sun was setting when they finally returned to the farmhouse. The air smelled of beans and fresh bread, and Chris's stomach reminded him of the breakfast none of them had eaten. To his surprise, Miriam gestured him toward the table. "You worked honest," she said simply. "That means you eat with us." They settled around the worn table, the food simple but plenty. Before anyone could reach for a plate, Miriam bowed her head. "Chris," she said softly, "would you lead us in grace?" He swallowed hard, nervous as a colt. Prayer came private to him, usually, whispered in barn lofts and under stars. But he bowed his head and spoke from his heart. "Lord," he began, voice rough with emotion, "thank you for this food and the hands that prepared it. Thank you for bringing me to this place, though I don't rightly understand your purpose yet. Help us find a way through these troubles and..." He paused, then finished quietly. "Help learn to trust each other, if it be your will." "Amen," Miriam echoed, and even Hester and Ruthie murmured the word. They ate in a silence, less strained than before. The simple meal made better by shared work and common purpose. Through the windows, they could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow's problems waited like shadows, but for now, there was food, shelter, and the first fragile threads of understanding dot when Chris rose to return to the barn. Hester spoke. "Breakfast is at sunrise," she said, not quite looking at him. "Don't be late." He nodded, understanding the significance of the invitation. "Yes, ma'am. I'll be here." The night air carried the scent of sage as Chris walked to the barn, his steps lighter despite his tired muscles. One day of work wouldn't solve their problems, but it was a start. In the darkness, he could almost believe that 4 lonely souls might find strength together, might even become something like family. A coyote called in the distance, and somewhere an owl answered. Chris settled into the hay, his prayers tonight more hopeful than desperate. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, but for now, he had purpose. And that was no small blessing. The first rays of sunlight found Chris already at the well, muscles aching from yesterday's fence mending. The wooden bucket creaked as he lowered it, the rope rough against his callous palms. Dawn painted the farmyard in soft colors, while roosters announced the day with determined crowing. "You're doing it wrong," Ruthie's voice cut through the morning quiet. She stood watching him, arms crossed. "That well rope's liable to snap if you don't balance the weight proper." Chris stepped back, letting her demonstrate. Despite her sharp tone, he noticed how she handled the equipment with practiced care. "Like this," she showed him. "Keep your back straight and let the pulley do the work." "Much obliged," he said quietly, following her example with the next bucket. The water splashed cold and clear into the holding trough. "Reckon you need to learn about Bessie next," Ruthie said, jerking her head toward the barn. Inside, a spotted dairy cow regarded them with peaceful eyes, chewing her cud. "Morning, old girl." Ruthie spoke more gently to the cow than she had to Chris. "This here's our new farmhand. Try not to kick him too hard." Chris approached slowly, remembering how skittish cattle could be around strangers. Bessie sniffed his offered hand, then bumped it with her wet nose. Ruthie's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "At least she's got sense enough to know decent folk," she muttered. "Now watch close. Milking's got to be done just so, or she'll hold back." The lesson that followed was filled with Ruthie's terse instructions and Bessie's patient tolerance of Chris's clumsy first attempts. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, he had managed to fill half a pail without getting kicked or spilling too much. "You'll do," Ruthie allowed finally. For a trail hand. The days fell into a pattern after that. Chris learned the rhythm of farm life, so different from the constant movement of cattle drives. Here, every task connected to the next like links. In a chain, water drawn from the well helped wash the milk pails, which fed the cats that kept the mice from the grain, which would become tomorrow's bread. But peace within the farm's boundaries couldn't stop the whispers that raced to town. Like wind-blown sparks, by Sunday morning, when they hitched the wagon for church, the sisters' faces already showed the strain of knowing what awaited them. The little white church stood proud against the prairie sky, its bell calling the faithful to worship. Chris helped the sisters down from the wagon, conscious of every eye upon them. They made their way to a back pew, while conversation stuttered to silence around them. "Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake," Miriam whispered, more to herself than to them. Chris saw how she held her head high, though her hands twisted nervously in her lap. The preacher mounted his pulpit, a thin man with sharp features and sharper eyes. His gaze swept the congregation before settling pointedly on their pew. "Today," he announced, "we shall speak of living upright before men, that our conduct might bring glory to God rather than shame to his name." What followed was a sermon that never named him directly, but left no doubt about its target. The preacher spoke of propriety and scandal, of the importance of clear boundaries between men and women. With each word, Chris felt the sisters grow, more rigid beside him. "Let us not be as those who dwell in shadows," the preacher's voice rose, "but rather walk in the light of righteous living." Heads turned their way throughout the service, and whispered comments carried in the still air. Chris caught fragments that made his ears burn with shame and anger. "3 wives for the virgin giant," one man muttered loud enough to be heard. "Ain't natural, ain't right. Shameless. All of them," came another whisper. When the final hymn faded, they waited for others to file out first, hoping to avoid direct confrontation. But the gauntlet of judgment remained, in averted eyes, in the way women gathered their skirts aside, in the sudden silence that followed them down the church steps. The ride home was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Ruthie stared straight ahead, her jaw set hard. Hester's face might have been carved from stone. Only Miriam showed her hurt openly, a single tear tracking down her cheek, though she wiped it away quickly. Evening found them in the farmhouse kitchen, the day's work done. But no one quite ready for sleep. Lamps burned against the gathering dark while Miriam worked at mending a torn shirt, her stitches small and neat despite her trembling fingers. Chris couldn't bear the silence anymore. "I never meant to bring shame to this house," he said quietly. "All I wanted was a place to belong, some roots to call my own." Miriam looked up from her sewing, her eyes gentle. "We know that, Chris. Your decency shows plain in every action, every word." "Decent or not," Ruthie burst out, "they've already decided what to think of us. Did you hear Mrs. Peterson? Acting like we're running some kind of—" She broke off, cheeks flaming. "Let them talk." Hester spoke for the first time since church. She stood at the window watching the night deepen outside. "We've weathered worse than whispers." But Chris saw how her shoulders sagged slightly, bearing a weight beyond physical. Tiredness. He remembered her fierce protection of her sisters, how she'd raised them after their kin vanished. This threat to their reputation must cut deep. They ate supper late that night, a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The usual meal time. Prayer felt especially fervent, asking strength for trials ahead. Afterward, no one seemed eager to seek their beds. Lamps burned well past their usual time as Ruthie cleaned her rifle with aggressive thoroughness. Hester reviewed the farm accounts, and Miriam continued her mending. Chris sat in the corner chair that had become unofficially his, whittling a piece of wood without real purpose. The lamplight cast their shadows large against the walls, 4 lonely figures drawn together by circumstance and need. Outside, a coyote called mournfully, and somewhere in the distance, another answered. The evening stretched long, each lost in thought but drawing comfort from the other's presence. They all felt it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new judgments. The storm of community opinion was gathering, dark clouds on their horizon. Yet, as Chris watched the sisters moving in their familiar patterns around the kitchen, he felt a surge of protective determination. These women had offered him a chance at belonging, however reluctantly at first. Their courage in facing down prejudice and hardship humbled him. Whatever came next, he silently vowed they would face it together. The lamps burned low, their light holding back the darkness for a little while longer. The spring sun beat down mercilessly as Chris worked the plow behind their old Mare. Sally. Sweat darkened his shirt and dripped from his brow, but he pressed on, determined to prepare the field for planting. Each furrow represented another small victory, another step toward making this land truly productive. From the corner of his eye, he caught Miriam watching from the kitchen window. She quickly turned away, busying herself with something inside. The memory of her gentle smile at breakfast warmed him more than the sun ever could. The days fell into a rhythm of endless tasks. Chris rose before dawn each morning, feeding the livestock and checking the fences before the sisters even stirred. By midday, he'd often accomplished what might take 2 men to complete. His massive frame, once a source of mockery, proved invaluable for the heavy work of farm life. "Roof needs mending," Hester announced one morning, pointing to where winter storms had torn away several shingles. "Been letting in water something fierce?" Chris nodded, already calculating what he'd need. That afternoon found him balanced on the steep pitch of the farmhouse roof, carefully replacing damaged boards and shingles. The sisters took turns bringing him water, though he noticed it was usually Miriam who appeared, her quiet presence a comfort in the hot afternoon. "You're doing fine work up there," she called softly, shading her eyes against the sun, "though I wish you'd be more careful." "Don't fret none," he replied, securing another shingle. "Done plenty of roof work in my time." The timber hauling proved the most challenging task. The farm's wood supply had dwindled dangerously low, and the nearest stand of suitable trees lay a good mile away. Chris spent 3 grueling days felling trees, trimming them to size, and hauling the heavy logs back to the farm. Each trip left him exhausted, muscles trembling from the effort. But he never complained. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Chris found Miriam by the well, struggling with a broken bucket. The handle had come loose, making it impossible to draw water properly. She looked up as he approached, frustration evident in her features. "Here, let me help," he offered, taking the bucket gently from her hands. Their fingers brushed briefly, sending a jolt through him that had nothing to do with the evening's chill. "It's been giving me trouble all day," she admitted, watching as he examined the damage. "Ruthie says we should just get a new one, but no need," Chris said, already pulling out his pocket knife. He worked carefully, whittling new notches in the handle and securing it more firmly to the bucket. Sometimes the old things just need a bit of care to keep going. Miriam smiled at that, and Chris felt his heart skip. They stood together in comfortable silence as he finished the repair, testing the handle to ensure it would hold. "There now," he said, demonstrating how it worked. "Should last a good while longer." "Thank you," she said softly, her hand resting briefly on his arm. The touch lingered even after she'd gone back inside Doppy's quiet moments with. Miriam became precious to Chris. They shared morning prayers, their voices joining in humble supplication. At supper, he found himself watching her hands as she passed. Dishes or mended clothing, admiring their strength and grace. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the table, and they'd share a smile over Ruthie's latest quip, or Hester's serious pronouncements, but their growing peace was shattered one afternoon by the arrival of 3 local ranchers. Chris was splitting wood in the yard when they rode up, their manner making it clear this wasn't a social call. "Boone," the leader called out, a weather-beaten man named Tucker. "Got word you ought to hear." Chris set down his axe and wiped his hands on his pants. The sisters emerged from the house, standing together on the porch like sentinels. "Railroads moving faster than expected," Tucker continued, his face grim. "Word is they're sending surveyors within weeks, maybe less." The news hit like a physical blow. Chris heard Miriam's sharp intake of breath behind him. "Thought you should know," another rancher added. "They're talking about putting the main line right through this valley. Won't matter much what paper you're holding when their lawyers get involved." "Much obliged for the warning," Chris said steadily, though his heart hammered in his chest. The ranchers tipped their hats and rode away, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Ruthie suddenly burst into tears, her usual fierce demeanor crumbling. "It ain't fair," she sobbed, sinking onto the porch steps. "We've worked so hard. This land is all we have left of our family." Miriam knelt beside her sister, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Even Hester looked shaken, her tall frame seeming to shrink under the weight of their situation. Chris moved to stand before them, his shadow falling across the porch steps. The sight of their distress stirred something deep within him, a fierce protectiveness he hadn't known he possessed. "I won't let this land be taken," he declared, his voice low but firm. "Not while I breathe." The words hung in the air, heavy, with promise. Miriam looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears and something else. Hope, perhaps, or trust newly formed. "We've got to fight this," Hester said, her voice stronger now. "Together." "Together," Chris agreed, and saw. The others nodded out. They worked until dusk that day, as if trying to prove their claim to the land through sheer effort. Chris finished splitting enough wood to fill the shed to bursting. Ruthie and Hester repaired a section of fence that had been waiting for attention, while Miriam tended to the vegetable garden with fierce determination. That evening, they gathered. Around the supper table, worn but united. The meal was simple: beans, cornbread, and the last of the winter preserves, but Chris couldn't remember food tasting better. Perhaps it was the way Miriam's knee occasionally brushed his under the table, or how Ruthie's tears had dried into renewed determination, or even Hester's quiet nod of approval when he asked to lead the blessing dot as night settled over the farm. Chris stepped onto the porch for a final check of the animals. The evening star hung bright in the darkening sky, a steady point of light in the gathering dusk. Behind him, lamplight spilled from the kitchen window, carrying the soft sounds of the sisters preparing for bed. Ruthie's laugh, Hester's measured tones, Miriam humming an old hymn. His heart felt full almost to bursting. Here, at last, was something worth fighting for. Not just land, but family, belonging, purpose. His gaze swept over the farm, taking in the newly mended roof. The split wood stacked neat and high, the freshly plowed fields waiting for seed. Every mark of his labor was a declaration. This is home. This is worth defending. The evening air carried the scent of spring earth and growing things, of life taking root and flourishing. Chris sent up a quiet prayer of gratitude, even as his mind turned to the challenges ahead. Whatever came next, they would face it together, bound by something stronger than mere necessity, the ties of chosen family, forged in trust and strengthened by shared purpose. Inside, Miriam called his name softly, reminding him it was time for evening prayers. Chris turned from the darkness, drawn to the warmth and light of home, his heart weary but hopeful. The afternoon sun beat down on the freshly tilled earth as Chris worked the fields. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, but satisfaction filled him at the sight of neat furrows stretching toward the horizon. A movement at the edge of his vision caught his attention. He straightened, shading his eyes against the glare. A small figure stumbled through the yard, weaving unsteadily between the chicken coop and the well. Chris's heart clenched at the sight. It was a boy no more than 9 or 10 years old, his clothes hanging in tatters from his thin frame. The child's face was smudged with dirt, and he shivered despite the warm spring afternoon. "Hey there," Chris called softly, not wanting to startle the boy. He set down his tools and approached slowly, the way he might a spooked colt. "You lost, son?" The boy's eyes darted between Chris and the farmhouse like a rabbit sizing up escape routes. His bare feet were caked with dust, suggesting he'd walked a long way. "I ain't lost," the boy mumbled, though his trembling voice suggested otherwise. Just looking for some place to rest a spell." By now, the commotion had drawn attention from the house. The screen door creaked open as Miriam stepped onto the porch, followed closely by Hester and Ruthie. "What's your name?" Chris asked, crouching down to the boy's level. "Samuel," came the quiet reply. "I'm 9 years old, sir." Hester's stern voice cut through the yard. "Where are your folks, boy?" Samuel's lower lip quivered. "Don't rightly know where Ma is now. Railroad men came through our settlement out west. There was lots of shouting and confusion. Got separated in all the chaos." His voice cracked on the last word. Chris's chest tightened at the pain in the child's voice. He looked up at the sisters, his expression pleading. "He needs feeding, at the very least." Hester's face remained stern, but Miriam was already moving down the porch steps. "Of course we'll feed him. Come along, Samuel. We've got a pot of stew." On the stove, Hester caught Chris's arm as he passed. "We can barely feed ourselves," she whispered sharply. "The Lord provides," he answered simply, following Samuel and Miriam into the house. The kitchen felt warmer somehow with Samuel perched at the table, his feet dangling well above the floor. Miriam ladled a generous portion of stew into a bowl, while Ruthie cut thick slices of bread. The boy's eyes grew wide at the sight of food, but he waited until Miriam nodded before picking up his spoon. Between careful bites, Samuel's story emerged in pieces. His mother was Kiowa, his father Anglo. They'd been living in a mixed settlement until the railroad's expansion forced them out. In the chaos of eviction, Samuel had become separated from his mother. He'd been wandering from farm to farm ever since doing odd jobs for meals. How long you been on your own? Chris asked gently. Samuel stirred his stew, considering. Since the leaves were still falling, been following the sun west, hoping to find Ma. Miriam's hand flew to her mouth, and even Hester's stern expression softened. The boy had been alone through the winter months. My mother taught me songs, Samuel offered suddenly, as if trying to prove he wasn't completely alone. She said they'd help me remember who I am. His voice carried a hint of pride beneath the exhaustion. Chris watched as Miriam knelt beside Samuel's chair, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She smoothed his tangled hair with a tender touch that made something catch in Chris's throat. The gesture seemed to break something loose in Samuel, and his small shoulders began to shake. I miss her so much, he whispered. Miriam gathered him close, murmuring soft words of comfort. Chris felt an unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a protective instinct he'd never experienced before. This child needed shelter, guidance, the simple security of knowing where his next meal would come from. You'll stay with us tonight, Chris declared, meeting Hester's eye steadily. After a long moment, she gave a slight nod. There's space in. Go loft, Ruthie offered. I can make up a bed with the spare quilts. The transformation in Samuel was immediate. Hope flickered across his face, chasing away some of the wariness that had aged him beyond his years. As the evening settled in. The kitchen filled with something that had been missing from the farm, the sound of children's laughter. Samuel proved to be a natural storyteller once his initial shyness wore off. He regaled them with tales of his travels, mimicking the various characters he'd met along the way. Even Hester couldn't suppress a smile at his impression of a grumpy. Old Shepherd. The next morning, Chris found Samuel already awake, watching the sunrise from the barn door. Want to learn something useful? He asked. Samuel nodded eagerly, following Chris to the woodpile. With patient instruction, Chris showed him how to hold a small hatchet, how to judge the grain of the wood, how to split kindling safely. The boy's face glowed with pride at each successful chop. My pa never taught me things, Samuel admitted quietly, carefully stacking his kindling. Left before I was walking. Chris's hand settled on the boy's shoulder. Well, there's plenty to learn. Here, if you're willing. Throughout the day, Samuel trailed after Chris like a shadow, helping with whatever tasks he could manage. He proved quick to learn and eager to please. His presence seemed to lift everyone's spirits. Ruthie taught him to collect eggs without spooking the hens, while Miriam showed him how to tell when cornbread was done by the sound it made when tapped. That evening, as Chris helped Samuel arrange his quilts in the loft, the boy asked hesitantly, "How long can I stay?" Before Chris could answer, Miriam's voice came from below. "As long as you need to, child." She climbed the ladder with an extra blanket tucked under her arm. Nights can still get mighty cold. They tucked Samuel in together, Miriam smoothing the quilts while Chris made sure the roof hatch was secured against the weather. The boy's eyes were already heavy with sleep, his small face peaceful in the lantern light as they descended the ladder. Miriam paused on the bottom rung. "You know something?" She whispered, her eyes soft in the dim light. "You already lead a family, even if you don't see it." Chris felt warmth spread through his chest at her words. He looked back up at the loft, where Samuel's quiet breathing had already settled into the rhythm of sleep. The boy's presence had changed something in the farm's atmosphere, filling empty spaces they hadn't even realized were there. Children's laughter echoed in the kitchen. Small footprints marked the dusty yard. And simple questions about the world around them made everything feel new again. Standing there in the barn's quiet darkness, Chris realized Miriam was right. Somewhere between the morning chores and evening prayers, between teaching Samuel to split kindling and watching Miriam comfort his tears. They had become something more than just allies against the railroad's threats. They had become a family. Unusual, perhaps, but bound together by something stronger than blood. The soft glow of the house's windows beckoned them across the yard, promising warmth and belonging. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had this moment, a child sleeping safely under their roof, and the knowledge that love could grow in the most unexpected places. The spring sun warmed the earth, coaxing tender shoots from the freshly tilled soil. Morning started early on the farm, with Chris and the sisters working side by side in the fields. Samuel followed them like an eager shadow, carrying water and tools. Proud to be useful, Chris wiped sweat from his brow, watching Miriam guide the boy in planting corn seeds. Her patience seemed endless, matching Samuel's stream of questions with gentle answers. The sight stirred something deep in his chest, a yearning he'd never dared name before. 3 fingers deep, just like that, Miriam demonstrated, her hands guiding Samuel's smaller ones in the rich soil. Then 2 seeds, like you're tucking them in for a nap. Will they dream about being tall corn? Samuel asked, carefully dropping the seeds. Miriam's laugh carried across the field. I reckon they might if you sing them that Kiowa planting song. Your ma taught you. Chris smiled, remembering how Samuel had shared the song at breakfast. The boy's voice had been shy at first, but grew stronger when Miriam joined in, humming along after the first verse. Even Hester's stern expression had softened at the pure sound of it. The afternoon passed in steady work, the family moving as one across the field. Ruthie kept them entertained with her wild stories, while Hester's quiet competence set the pace. By supper time, they'd planted nearly half the field, after the evening meal. Chris found himself lingering at the table, watching Miriam clear away the dishes. Samuel had fallen asleep in Ruthie's lap by the fire, worn out from his day's labors. Might be nice to walk a spell, Chris suggested quietly. Check on the new foal in the corral. Miriam's eyes met his, warm with understanding. I'd like that. The evening air carried the sweet scent of wild plum blossoms as they walked toward the corral. Their shoulders nearly touched, and Chris felt every inch of space between them, like a current of electricity. Samuel's taken to you something fierce, Miriam said softly. You got away with him. Chris ducked his head, embarrassed by the praise. He's a good boy. Makes it easy to care. They reached the corral fence, leaning against the worn wood. The mare and her foal moved like shadows in the gathering dusk, peaceful and unhurried. I want to thank you, Miriam said suddenly, for your kindness to Samuel, to all of us. She turned to face him, her eyes bright in the fading light. I never thought I'd have a chance at a real family again, after everyone left. But lately, Chris prompted when she fell silent. Lately I'd been dreaming again. About children's laughter in the house, about Sunday dinners with loved ones gathered close. She looked down at her hands. Foolish dreams, maybe. Not foolish, Chris said roughly. His heart hammered against his ribs. I have spent my whole life being laughed at. The virgin giant, too awkward to court, too simple to amount to anything. But here, he gestured to the farm, the fields they'd worked together. Here I feel like maybe I could be more than their jokes. Miriam's hand found his on the fence rail. You already are, she whispered. Your heart speaks so much louder than their gossip, Chris Boone. Anyone with eyes to see knows your worth. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken things. Chris turned toward her, his free hand lifting as if to touch her cheek. Riders coming. Ruthie's sharp voice cut through the twilight. 6, maybe 7 of them. Chris straightened, reluctantly letting go of Miriam's hand. Through the gathering darkness, they could make out a group of mounted men approaching the farm. The glint of rifles caught what remained of the daylight. Get Samuel inside, Chris ordered quietly, and fetch my shotgun from the barn. Miriam squeezed his arm once before hurrying toward the house. Chris strode out to meet the riders, his height drawing him up like armor. The surveyors pulled their horses to a stop in the yard, led by a thin man in a city suit. 2 armed guards flanked him, their hands resting too casually on their weapons. Evening. The thin man called out, "Railroad business. We're here to survey this parcel for the new line." "This is private property," Chris said firmly. "Purchase legal and proper. We have orders to map all lands along the proposed route." The man produced a paper from his jacket. "This gives us right of access." "That paper ain't been decided by any court," Chris countered. "Until it is, this land belongs to the Boone. Family, you're not welcome here after dark." The armed guards shifted in their saddles, but Chris held his ground. He could hear Ruthie's boots on the porch behind him, knew she'd have his shotgun ready. The thin man's face hardened. "The railroad doesn't take kindly to interference, Mr. Boone. We'll be back with more than just surveyors." "When you do, bring a proper court order," Chris said evenly. "Until then, I suggest you ride on before it gets too dark to see the trail." For a long moment, the tension crackled like heat lightning. Then the thin man yanked his horse's head around. "Your choice, Boone. Remember that when things get difficult. Chris watched until the riders disappeared into the darkness. Only then did he let his shoulders sag, the weight of the confrontation settling over him like a heavy coat. Inside, the family gathered around the kitchen table. Samuel's eyes were wide with fear, but he sat straight back between Miriam and Ruthie. Hester poured coffee with hands that shook only slightly. "They'll be back," Hester said into the silence. "Yes." Chris accepted a cup of coffee. "But we'll be ready." They ate their cold supper quietly, each lost in thought. Samuel fell asleep again at the table, and Chris carried him up to his bed in the loft. When he came back down, he found Miriam waiting with the lantern. "The tools need sharpening," she said softly. "I'll help." They worked together in the barn until late into the night, the rhythm of the whetstone a steady counterpoint to their quiet conversation. The plowshare needed attention, and the axes had grown dull with use. Each tool they sharpened felt like preparation for a siege. "We won't let them take it," Chris said as they finished, more to himself than to Miriam. "This farm, this family, we built something worth fighting for." Miriam's hand found his in the lantern light, warm and sure. No words were needed. They both knew what lay ahead would test them all, but they would face it together, the lanterns. Glow guided them back to the house, where the windows glowed with lamplight and the promise of home. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight they had this, a family united. A love growing stronger than fear, and the courage to stand their ground. The morning after the surveyors' visit brought a fresh wave of trouble rolling in from town like storm clouds. Chris heard the whispers as he loaded supplies at the general store. Saw the sidelong glances and huddles of conversation that broke apart when he drew near. "Living in sin with 3 women," one man muttered just loud. "Enough to carry. Ain't natural." Chris gripped the flour sack tighter, his knuckles white against the rough burlap. He'd expected judgment, but the venom in their voices cut deeper than he'd imagined. The shopkeeper's wife crossed herself as he passed, as if his very presence might taint the air. Back at the wagon, he found Samuel waiting, small face pinched with worry. "They're saying mean things about our family," the boy said. Quietly, Chris lifted Samuel onto the wagon seat. "Some folks judge what they don't understand, son. Best we keep our heads high and let our actions speak true." They were halfway home, when hoofbeats approached from behind. The Reverend Matthews drew his horse alongside, his usually gentle face stern beneath his black hat. "Brother Boone," he called, "might I ride with you to the farm? There are matters requiring discussion." Chris nodded tightly. "You're welcome to follow, Reverend." At the farmhouse, Miriam met them in the yard. Her eyes widened at the sight of the preacher, but she maintained her dignity. "Welcome, Reverend. Would you care for coffee?" Inside, they gathered around the kitchen table. Chris, the 3 sisters, and Reverend Matthews. Samuel lingered by the stove, pretending to sweep while stealing worried glances at the adults. The preacher cleared his throat. "I come with pastoral concern for this unusual arrangement." He folded his hands on the table. "The community is disturbed. Questions of propriety arise. It would be best to regularize matters through marriage. Regularize? Ruthie's voice crackled with anger. You mean force one of us to marry a stranger to satisfy gossip? The Lord's ways are clear, Matthews insisted. One man, one woman, joined in holy matrimony. This current situation invites scandal and sin. Chris straightened in his chair. With respect, Reverend, marriage ain't a tool to be used for convenience. It's sacred, meant for love, not satisfying property laws or quieting wagging tongues. You would mock the sanctity of marriage by living thus with 3 unmarried women? We mock nothing, Chris said firmly. We're folks trying to survive with dignity. I won't shame these women or myself by treating marriage as anything less than a holy bond. The preacher opened his mouth to argue further, but a harsh cough from Hester interrupted him. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to stifle it. Sister. Miriam touched her arm in concern. Hester waved her off. Just the dust. But her voice was weaker than usual, and a sheen of sweat had broken out on her forehead. The preacher left soon after, his warnings about propriety and scandal hanging heavy in the air. As Miriam showed him out, Hester's cough grew worse. She tried to stand but swayed dangerously. Doc Chris crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, catching her before she could fall. How long have you been hiding this sickness? Hester tried to pull away, but another fit of coughing doubled her over. Can't afford to be weak, she gasped. Hester. Ruthie cried out as her sister's legs gave way entirely. Chris lifted Hester into his arms, shocked by how light she felt. All her fierce pride couldn't hide how illness had worn her down. He carried her upstairs to her bedroom, laying her gently on the quilt while Miriam hurried to fetch water and medicines. Don't need fussing, Hester protested weakly, but her face was gray with exhaustion. You've carried enough burdens alone, Chris said quietly. Let us help now. Miriam returned with her herb basket and began brewing a tea for Hester's cough. Ruthie paced the room, tears streaming down her face. We can't lose her too, she whispered. Not after everyone else left. Chris caught her shoulder, steadying her. We won't. Your sister's strong as oak. She just needs rest and care now. Samuel appeared in the doorway, clutching his small wooden cross. Without a word, he climbed onto the bed beside Hester and took her hand. The gesture seemed to break something in her, and she finally allowed Miriam to help her drink the medicinal tea. As night fell, the family kept vigil. Miriam tended to Hester with gentle hands, while Ruthie sat rigid in the corner, as if her watchfulness alone could keep death at bay. Chris settled into the room's old rocking chair, with Samuel drowsy in his lap. The boy's small voice broke the quiet. God sent you to us for a reason, Pa Chris. He knew we needed you. Chris's heart clenched at the simple faith in those words. He smoothed Samuel's dark hair, praying the boy was right. Outside, a whippoorwill called lonely in the darkness, and the sound seemed to carry all their fears into the night. Hours passed. Hester's breathing eased somewhat with Miriam's medicines, but fever still burned in her cheeks. Chris sent the others to bed, promising to watch through the night. In the lamp's low glow, he studied Hester's face, usually so stern and controlled, now vulnerable in sleep. He remembered her challenge that first day, her fierce protection of her sisters. She'd carried the weight of their survival alone for so long. Now, watching her struggle for each breath, Chris felt the mantle of responsibility settle more firmly on his own shoulders. This wasn't just about keeping the land anymore. It was about protecting the family they'd become. Near midnight, Hester stirred. Why are you still here? She asked hoarsely. Because family stays, Chris answered simply. Rest now. I'm keeping watch. A ghost of her usual frown crossed her face. Never wanted to need help. Ain't about wanting, Chris said. It's about accepting what's offered freely. She studied him through fever-bright eyes. You're a better man than we first reckoned. Just trying to live up to the trust you've given me. Hester's hand found his in the darkness. Keep them safe, she whispered. Whatever comes. I will, Chris promised. But you'll be here to help. We need your strength, too. She didn't answer, having drifted back to sleep, but her grip on his hand remained. Chris settled deeper into the chair, Samuel warm against his chest, and kept his vigil through the long hours till dawn. As first light crept through the window, Chris heard Hester's breathing ease into a more natural rhythm. The fever seemed to have broken in the night. Miriam appeared in the doorway, her face soft with relief as she checked her sister. "The worst has passed," she whispered, though she need time to recover her strength. Chris nodded, careful not to wake Samuel. "We'll manage. The Lord provides." "What's needed?" Miriam's hand brushed his shoulder as she passed. "He surely does," she murmured. "He sent us you." The morning sun strengthened, painting the room in hope's colors. Chris held on to Samuel's words from the night before, that God had sent him here for a reason. Looking at his sleeping family, he felt the truth of it in his bones. Whatever storms gathered on the horizon, they would weather them together. The days after Hester fell ill blurred together like watercolors in rain. Chris rose before the sun each morning, shoulders already aching from yesterday's work, and trudged out to face the endless chores. The farm demanded constant attention, cows needing milking, fences requiring mending, fields crying out for tending in the dim light of dawn. Chris paused at the water pump, splashing his face and studying his reflection in a bucket. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, but he couldn't afford rest. Not with Hester confined to bed, her usual iron will tempered by fever and exhaustion. "You shouldn't carry it all alone," Miriam's soft voice came from behind him. She stood in her work dress, hair already neatly braided for the day. "You've got enough, tending to Hester," Chris protested, but Miriam shook her head. "We share burdens here," she said firmly, reaching for the milk pail. "That's what family does." Together they fell into a rhythm, Chris mucking the barn while Miriam milked, then both of them feeding chickens and gathering eggs. Their hands brushed as they passed tools back and forth, sending warmth through Chris's tired body despite the morning chill. When the sun climbed higher, they paused for a simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee. Samuel joined them, his small face serious as he bowed his head for grace. Chris led the prayer, his voice growing stronger with practice. "Lord, we thank you for this food, for the strength to work your land, and for the blessing of each other. Watch over Hester's healing, and guide us in your wisdom. Amen." "Amen," Miriam echoed softly, her eyes meeting his across the table. The days developed a pattern. Mornings belonged to chores, afternoons to fieldwork. In the evenings, Chris and Miriam would sit with Hester, reading from scripture or simply keeping quiet company while she rested. Sometimes they lingered after she dozed off, whispering encouragement to each other by lamplight. "You're doing well," Miriam told him one night, her hand light on his arm. "Better than we could have hoped." "Just trying to be worthy of the trust you've given me," Chris replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You already are?" she said simply. Those quiet moments sustained him through the backbreaking days. There was something holy in their shared purpose in the way their prayers mingled in the darkness. Chris found himself watching Miriam more and more, the grace in her movements, the kindness in her eyes, the strength behind her gentle ways. But their fragile peace couldn't last. One night, as storm clouds gathered thick and dark, thunder rolled across the prairie like God's own drums. Rain lashed the windows while wind howled through every crack in the old farmhouse walls. Chris was banking the kitchen fire when Samuel burst through the door, rain streaming from his hair. "Pa, Chris, come quick, there's somebody at the gate." "What?" Chris grabbed his coat. "Who'd be out in this weather?" "A lady, she fell down." Samuel's voice cracked with panic. "Please hurry." Chris rushed out into the downpour, Miriam close behind with a lantern. Through the curtain of rain, they could make out a crumpled form by the gate. As they drew closer, Chris saw it was a native woman, her dark hair plastered to her face, her clothes soaked through. "She needs help," Miriam said, already kneeling beside the stranger. But before they could lift her, Samuel let out a cry that pierced the storm's roar. "Mama! It's my mama!" The woman's eyes fluttered open at his voice. "Samuel?" She whispered. "My son? Mama." Samuel threw himself down beside her, sobbing as he clutched at her dress that Chris and Miriam exchanged shocked glances. This was Samuel's lost mother, the one he'd spoken of with such longing. "Let's get her inside," Chris said, gathering the woman into his arms. She was frighteningly light, as if grief had hollowed her out in the kitchen's warmth. They helped her into a chair while Miriam heated broth. Samuel wouldn't leave her side, holding her hand and weeping. The woman's eyes never left his face, drinking in every detail as if afraid he might vanish. "I am Nehima," she said finally, her voice accented but clear. "I have searched so long for my boy." "You're safe now," Miriam assured her, pressing a cup of broth into her trembling hands. "Please drink this." From the doorway came Ruthie's anxious voice. "What's happening down here?" "Samuel's mother has found him," Chris explained quietly. Ruthie's eyes widened. "Does Hester know?" "I know," came Hester's weak voice as she appeared on the stairs, leaning heavily on the rail. Despite Miriam's protests, she made her way to the kitchen table. "A Kiowa woman," Hester observed, studying their guest. "How did you lose your boy?" Nehima's face tightened with pain. "The railroad men came. They said our land was theirs now. Though we had papers from the government, my husband tried to stop them." She trailed off, grief closing her throat. "They killed him?" Chris asked gently. Nehima nodded. In the confusion, Samuel ran. "I searched every farm, every town. The railroad takes more land each month, pushing us further from our homes. I have walked so far." Her story hung in the air like smoke, bitter with injustice. Chris felt anger rise in his chest. The same railroad threatening their farm had destroyed this woman's life, scattered her family to the winds. "You'll stay here tonight," he said firmly. "Both of you." "But the talk," Ruthie started to protest. "Let them talk," Chris cut her off. "This is about what's right." Hester studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The boy's mother has claimed to our help, whatever folks might say." Miriam was already gathering blankets and setting places at the table. Soon they sat together over bowls of simple stew, while the storm raged outside. Samuel pressed close to his mother, as if afraid she might disappear again. Nehima's face softened as she watched him eat, reaching occasionally to smooth his hair. "The railroad claims this land too?" she asked finally. "They're trying," Chris admitted. "But we mean to fight them." "Fighting is costly," Nehima said quietly. "I have seen its price. Some things are worth fighting for," Chris replied, looking around the table at these people who had become his family. "Justice, home, the right to live in peace on land that's rightfully yours." Nehima met his gaze steadily. "Yes, these things are worth much." As the meal ended, Miriam showed Nehima and Samuel to the spare room, making up a bed with fresh quilts. Chris stayed behind to bank a fire, his mind turning over the day's events. Their struggle wasn't just about keeping a deed anymore. It was about standing against the greed that would steal homes and tear families apart without conscience. He looked up to find Miriam watching him from the doorway. "You did right tonight," she said softly. "Seemed the only choice a God-fearing man could make," he replied. She crossed to stand beside him, their shoulders barely touching. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. Perhaps he sent Nehima to show us. We're not alone in this fight. Reckon you're right." Chris stared into the dying flames. "Makes me wonder how many others have lost their land, their kin, their hopes, all to fill railroad coffers." "Then we must stand stronger together," Miriam said, simply. Outside, the storm was passing. Through the window, stars began to peek through, breaking clouds, their light steady and true. Chris felt something settle in his spirit, a deeper purpose taking root. Whatever came next, they would face it as one family, bound together by mercy and justice. The night deepened around the old farmhouse, while inside, 9-year-old Samuel slept safe in his mother's arms for the first time in too long. Chris made one last check of the doors before heading to his bed in the barn, his heart full of gratitude and resolve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had witnessed God's hand at work, bringing the lost home and binding broken pieces back together as morning light spilled across the farmhouse kitchen. Nehima sat with Chris and the sisters, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. Hester, still weak but improving, listened from her chair by the stove as Nehima revealed the truth about her land. "The treaty papers are clear," Nehima explained, her voice steady. "The railroad cannot take what the government promised to my people. My land joins yours at the creek bend. Together they would make one strong holding." Chris's heart thumped against his ribs as he understood her meaning. Combined, their properties could form an unbreakable legal shield. He glanced at Miriam, catching the shadow that crossed her face. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Hester said quietly. "Perhaps he guided you here for just this purpose." Samuel played with wooden blocks near the hearth, humming a Kiowa song his mother had taught him. The sight of the boy's contentment tugged at Chris's heart even as confusion churned inside him. When dusk approached, Chris walked out to the wheat fields alone. Stars were just beginning to pierce the darkening sky as he dropped to his knees in the fresh-turned earth. "Lord," he whispered, "show me the path. My heart belongs to Miriam, but Nehima and Samuel need protection. What is your will in this?" Footsteps whispered through the wheat behind him. He knew without turning that it was Miriam. "You shouldn't shrink from what must be done," she said softly, her voice thick with unshed tears. Marriage to Nehima would secure everything. The land, Samuel's future, justice itself. Chris stood, his hands trembling. "But, Miriam, I do what's right," she cut in. "Not what's easy." A tear slid down her cheek, catching the last light of day. Some sacrifices are holy. The truth of her words pierced him like a blade. Love, real love, sometimes meant letting go. He reached for her hand, held it briefly, then released it. Back inside the farmhouse, Chris found Samuel and drew him close, breathing in the boy's sweet scent. "You're safe here," he promised. "You and your mama both. Nehima met his eyes across the room, understanding passing between them unspoken dot as night settled fully. They gathered by the hearth, the sisters. Nehima, Samuel, and Chris. The firelight wrapped them in its warm glow, casting dancing shadows. On the walls, no one spoke of what was to come, but peace settled over them like a blanket. Fragile yet real dot the next morning dawned clear and cool as Chris hitched the wagon. His hands moved steady despite the weight in his heart. Nehima sat tall in her best dress. Samuel pressed close to her side. Miriam climbed up last, her fingers gripping the wooden seat until her knuckles went white. Hooves clattered on the packed dirt of Bent Creek's main street. Townsfolk stopped to stare as the unusual party made their way to the courthouse. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Men's faces darkened with judgment. Inside the courthouse, dust motes danced in shafts of morning light. The clerk's spectacles slipped down his nose as he gaped at them. "You mean to marry the Indian woman?" "I do," Chris said firmly. His voice carried through the quiet room. "Nehima deserves protection under the law. Her son deserves a father." The clerk shuffled papers nervously. "This is irregular. Very irregular." "The papers are sound," Chris insisted. "We're here proper and legal." Nehima stood straight-backed, her dignity a quiet force. Samuel clung to her skirts, watching with solemn eyes. Miriam remained by the door, her face composed though her hands trembled. Just as the clerk began preparing the documents, boots thundered. On the wooden steps, the railroad's lawyer burst in, face flushed with fury. "You can't allow this. It's a transparent scheme to block progress." The clerk examined Nehima's treaty papers, then the marriage license. "The law is clear. They're combined. Holdings create a protected homestead. The railroad has no claim." Chris signed his name with deliberate strokes. Nehima added hers, her hand steady. No rings were exchanged. This was partnership, not romance. Outside, the morning had warmed. Chris helped Nehima into the wagon as townspeople gathered to watch. Some faces showed disgust, but others held quiet respect. Old Widow Jenkins even stepped forward to press a small bouquet into Nehima's hands. The ride home stretched long and quiet. When they reached the farm, Miriam touched Chris's arm as he helped her down. "Your sacrifice saved us all," she whispered, tears brightening her eyes. "God sees your heart." That evening, they gathered around the supper table. The sisters, Nehima, Samuel, and Chris. Steam rose from bowls of stew. Lamplight cast off shadows. No one spoke of love or loss, but peace settled over them like a prayer. Justice had been done, even at the cost of the heart. Summer spread like honey across the land, warming the farm with golden light. Each morning brought new signs of healing to the blended household. The sound of hammering echoed across the yard. As Chris showed Samuel how to build the new barn, board by careful board. "Hold it steady now, son," Chris would say, guiding Samuel's small hands on the nail. The boy's face glowed with pride at each successful strike, and Chris felt his own heart swell at the word son, coming so naturally to his lips in the fields. Nehima worked with quiet purpose, planting rows of sacred blue corn passed down through generations of her people. She sang soft Kiowa prayers over the seedlings, her voice carrying on the breeze. Ruthie, initially standoffish, found herself drawn to the melodies. Soon she was learning the songs, her clear voice joining Nehima's in harmony. "The corn remembers," Nehima explained, showing Ruthie how to check the soil. "It grows stronger when we honor the old ways." Inside the farmhouse, Miriam tended to Hester with gentle patience. Day by day, color returned to the eldest sister's cheeks. Though she remained in bed, Hester's sharp tongue softened as she watched her unlikely family through the window. "Never thought I'd see such a sight," she admitted to Miriam one afternoon, watching Chris lift Samuel onto his shoulders while Nehima and Ruthie worked nearby. "But perhaps the Lord knows better than we do." The preacher's visit one Sunday brought unexpected blessing. Standing in their yard, he raised his hands over the gathered family. "Let none speak ill of what God has joined," he declared. "This household shows courage few could muster." That evening, gathered around the supper table, Samuel's clear voice rose in prayer. "Thank you, Lord, for giving me 2 mothers, 3 aunts, and a father who builds things strong." Laughter rippled around the table, real laughter, free from tension. Chris caught Miriam's eye across the bowls of steaming food and saw his own gratitude reflected there. Though his heart still ached with unspoken love, he felt God's hand in this strange, beautiful family they'd become. As crickets sang. In the twilight, Chris watched Samuel lean against Nehima, saw Ruthie teaching her a hymn, and felt Hester's approving nod. Perhaps this was what faith looked like, building something new from broken pieces, trusting that love would find its way. Golden wheat rippled in the late summer breeze as the family worked side by side in the fields. Chris's shirt clung to his back with honest sweat, while Samuel darted between them, carrying water to each worker. Nehima and Ruthie moved in practiced rhythm, their scythes flashing in the sunlight. Even Hester, though still weak, sat in the shade sorting grain, her fingers moving with familiar skill. Miriam paused to wipe her brow, and Chris caught her eye across the rows. Without a word, they both drifted toward the barn, drawn by something stronger than themselves. In the cool shadows among fresh hay, they stood close, their hearts thundering. "I've loved you since that first morning," Chris whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "But I'll never dishonor what's right." Miriam touched his weathered hand. "Your sacrifice made you worthy of that love," she said softly. "We'll honor Nehima and keep faith. That's what makes this family strong." Their moment was interrupted by wagon wheels crunching in the yard. They emerged to find neighbors arriving, arms laden with baskets and pies. Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife, stepped forward first, offering fresh bread. "We've been wrong," she admitted. "Your family shows us what grace looks like." The long table groaned under shared dishes as twilight painted the sky purple. Neighbors and family sat together, passing plates and mending bridges with each shared bite. Hester rose slowly, gripping the table's edge. "When this giant of a man bought our farm," she said, her voice carrying clear across the yard, "I thought him a fool or worse. Now I know better. Chris Boone is the patriarch this home needed, not through force, but through mercy." Nehima began, To sing then, her voice rising in ancient Kiowa melody. Ruthie's feet found the rhythm, tapping against the wooden floor. Samuel's laughter rang out pure and clear as he danced between them all. The lamplight caught tears in Chris's eyes as he looked around the room, at Miriam's gentle smile, at Nehima's dignified grace, at his son's joy, at the sisters who'd become family. That $50 had bought more than land. It had purchased the foundation for something far more precious, a home where love and justice dwelled together. Autumn painted the farm in shades of amber and gold. Frost sparkled on fence. Posts each morning, and the harvest moon hung low and full in the evening sky. The railroad's threats had withered like summer leaves, powerless against the united land claim that Chris and Nehima's marriage had forged. On a bright Sunday morning, the family dressed in their finest clothes. Chris adjusted his collar nervously. As they loaded into the wagon, Samuel sat proudly between him and Nehima, while the sisters arranged their skirts on the wooden seats. The church bell rang clear across the valley as they approached. Heads turned as they entered, but the whispers now held respect instead of scorn. The preacher's voice carried strong through the morning air as he called them forward. His family, he declared, his hand raised in blessing, shows us how God's grace works in mysterious ways. Through their example, we learn that mercy builds stronger bonds than judgment. Chris stood tall, Nehima dignified beside him, while Miriam, Ruthie, and Hester flanked them like pillars of strength. Samuel beamed as the congregation murmured. Faces that once twisted with mockery now nodded in approval. Even old Mr. Peterson, who'd been their harshest critic, reached out to shake Chris's hand after the service. Back at the farm, they gathered around the supper table as evening settled in. Lamplight cast warm shadows on the walls, and the fireplace crackled with fresh split oak. Chris bowed his head, his deep voice steady with gratitude. Lord, he prayed, you turned my shame into honor. You built a family from loneliness. Thank you for showing us that your ways are higher than our ways. Under the table, Miriam's hand found his, her touch saying more than words could express. Samuel leaned against Chris's arm, secure in his father's strength. Nehima hummed softly as she passed the bread, while Ruthie and Hester shared knowing glances across steaming bowls. The mockery of virgin giant had faded like morning mist. In its place stood something far greater, a patriarch whose strength lay not in size or might, but in the mercy that had built a dynasty of hope from $50 and unshakable faith. If today's story reminded you of the quiet strength of love, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow we'll meet right here, where love speaks softly and stays.